Yes, you used to see more like this, running around with the mic. But why this attire today? What is different about me with or without it? Apparently, our appearance symbolizes something. It communicates cultural meaning. Formalities registered in and attributed to particular type of attire belongs to a codified system with its strange rules. What is appropriate and why? Why my appearance matters to the degree that I shall navigate between different dress codes in a single day. I bike to campus, help as a TA here, have graduate classes elsewhere, and if I'm lucky, I might get to the gym once a week. Can I use the same outfit showing up in a meeting with Professor Ernst in shorts and my wrinkled t-shirt? Much of my chagrin, I sometimes do. But what determines dress codes and their social relevance? Implicit or explicit? If clothes convey some sort of social message, if they signify something about me, if they correspond to different circumstances, or at least supposed to do so, my identity, therefore, should be incomplete without that. It is an addition to my identity, my sense of self. You know that I am the same person, the same annoying person if you are in my recitations. No matter what I put on, the same thing. At the same time, this mask, this representational veneer does something. You always see with inside that, not even as a background element, but as constitutive of the ways that you understand who I am. Clothing symbolizes cultural meaning, precisely because its language has a grammar, a code. If you wish for its interpretation, all we understand, but I have this look to express my respect for the position that I'm occupying at this moment. We are dealing with conventions here. I'm not suggesting that coupling a representational system with a rigid system of meaning making is inherently traditional. But traditions are at work in providing a common mode of reading of cultural signs. My expression of respect for you and for this place is only intelligible if we all share the same symbolic horizon. You read the message inscribed in the mute language of my representation, of my appearance. Yet, is there anything beyond the discursive content here? That is, anything beyond the social system of signification and meaning production? Does the form of my attire change something in me? In other words, can I do this, or more accurately, does my attire authorize something like that? It is not only that the representational layer communicate meaning, formalities or informalities, hopelessness or joy. It also expresses its power on me. It exerts some power on my being. I'm under the spell of my suit, so to speak. It is from, in this form, the form of this clothes, the form itself, forces me to behave and act in certain ways. Finally, it brings me closer to the symbolic position I'm supposed to occupy. If you allow me, I can confuse you further. No? To put it differently, my subjectivity is shaped by my embodiment of a symbolic position through submission to the forces exerted by a representational system. The formality of this suit forces me to do something, to behave differently. I no longer can run with the mic, perhaps I should walk. Judith Butler calls this dialectical relationship performativity. I become a lecturer precisely because Professor Ernst has ascribed that symbolic naming, lecturer, and since I submit to a system of norms that forces me to perform that position. Forms are cultural systems. Forms and cultural systems, therefore, can do two things. They have two functions, in other words. Through their representational functions, they communicate cultural meanings. And B, their structures and their discursive functions shape and mold different subject formations. Let me step back for a minute. It seems to me that the primary function of a cloth is to cover us, even before it conveys any meaning. It basically separates us from the environment, embracing our bodies with its interiority. We are, after all, inside our clothes, unless the emperor is naked. What else does the same thing, covering, separating, protecting, sheltering, what else do that? What else do these functions? Any ideas? Think about this room called Nelson Mandela Auditorium. It is not only accommodating us, not only symbolizing etiquette and formalities, it also disciplines us into certain spatial and bodily possibilities. Take this image, for instance. I see a horrible problem here. This is my Carroll area in the Davis Library. You see the chair. It is tyrannical. It is rather criminal. Yes, it perfectly serves its purpose. Yes, it communicates its meaning. And yes, it has certain aesthetics. All good and well. The problem is that while we are different, it is always the same. No matter who you are, tall or short, man and woman, old or young, it treats you the same. You might say, what are you complaining from? Thankfully, this is perhaps the only instance in our current society that racism and sexism are not at work. Agreed. Nonetheless, the point is that beyond their immediate function or functional capacities, a chair for sitting, for instance, spatial configurations force us into their space of possibilities. Of course, you can do more with a chair, transcending its normative function, but you need to be Britney Spears, I suppose, to do that. Before it gets too late, let's come back to our own auditorium. A spatial configuration is suggestive of some fundamental dimensions or aspects. One, there is purpose being served by them. You all have a personal space here with a minimal distance securing your spatial but not visual privacy. Some of you can check your phone as you are doing. The functional dimension extends to the question of visibility, where each row is elevated enough that you can see the stage. Any suggestion why this room is that deep, but not more? Why the last row is there, but not further? You need to see and hear me without a mic. The space affords a system of circulation through corridors, entrances, and movements and steps. So there are multiple layers of functionality within a space. It is an auditorium, but it also does all other things. What a space do and the ways that activities are possible is called functionality. Aesthetic, on the other hand, pertains to the question of taste, beauty, proportions, and judgment. We think that this room is beautiful or ugly. Stability talks about the techniques of buildings and structure that sustain the stability and durability of the building, but also economic rationality. This building stands, and we are sure about that. This is architecture, but there is yet a more complex spatial system. Any guess? What gets more complex than architecture? Along the same lines, and the topic of this lecture. What is more complex than architecture? And is still architectural? Any idea? More than that? Excellent. Cities. Cities. Yes, of course, it has been polis for Greece, for Greeks, civitas for Romans, and inner city or Sharistan for Persians. But what about Islamic cities? What about Medinas? The question is this: can we still explain a city using what we just said about the chair, Mysore, and amphitheater? Can you explain a city using those concepts? Functions are more complex. Instead of single purpose, we are dealing with entire range of human activities: houses, hospitals, restaurants, an infinite mode of encounters, public spaces, roads, walkways. What about aesthetics? Cities are not only historical entities, they also resemble living organisms with moments of birth, growth, demise, and perhaps resurrection. Their aesthetics, therefore, is not singular, but multi-layered. You remember Professor Ernst talked about palimpsest. Do you know what was that? Palimpsest? Anybody? It's about a paper, ancient paper, the way of writing on that. Thoughts? Palimpsest? They didn't have papers, right? They were writing on animals' skin. And it was hard to produce the paper. So they were washing what they already had and adding a layer into that, right? That was palimpsest. Cities are like that. Cities are predominantly comprised of buildings, which is to say, architecture is constitutive of urbanism. You can create a city all out of parks and landscapes, again, unless you are Britney Spears. To talk about cities, it is inevitable to talk about what type of architecture are contained within that larger structural principles called cities. There is a crucial point here, and that's the element of time or temporality. Think about how a very small settlement comprising of few houses gradually and organically becomes larger and larger. As time passes by and as social, economic, and political structure are consolidated, more building types emerge to serve new demands. A small settlement does not have big institutions, whether institutions of political power or religious institutions, built over time based on the speed and intensity of growth that accommodates more complex elements. A small marketplace becomes a huge bazaar, and a tiny courtyard prayer space turns into a grand mosque. The problem that we have is that we assumed for a long time through Orientalist thinking that beyond Persian Empire architecture, the grandiose architecture of Persian architecture, and the empire, and it's what has remained for us in its shape of ruins, but also in the form of Roman and Greek architecture, Arabian Peninsula didn't have anything but tents. But that's a reduction, and we'll see why. If you want to start a city from scratch, the story is entirely different. Before the Renaissance attempts in conceiving ideal cities, Muslim rulers, those who have been able to secure a degree of stability and political solidarity, often have aspired to realize a utopian idea of a perfect city, or Madinatul Fazale. It was not only an attempt to shape an immersive urban settings that new forms of ethical life would be possible, it was also an expression of political unity, stability, and power. Umayyad Khalif Abdul Malik, commissioning the construction of the Dome of the Rock in this is the image that I mentioned, that it was not just Bedouin tents, but they had already forms of urban life. And you will see that with the growth of cities, more complex social, political, and cultural system added. Dome of the Rock in 1961 stands as an excellent example here. Although lines of Quranic verses and some decorative elements pertaining to the ornamentation can be ascribed to an Islamic visual representation, the construction techniques and spatial configurations were nothing new. It was an appropriation of the existing architectural styles that themselves were the product of centuries of cultural exchange between Byzantines and Sassanids. What is this? Do anybody know what is that? Yes, please. Aqueducts. What is the function of aqueducts? Carry water. Roman cities and many cities across the region needed to bring clean water, edible water. They needed to bring it from far distance. And because of the topography, they needed to elevate this water so it kind of hovers around and kind of allows the water to step down. Very good. But what is, and you see here that the same technique of constructing aqueducts have been used to span large ceilings, right? You use that technique to cover spaces. The Mosque Cathedral of Cordoba, also known as the Great Mosque of Cordoba, Cathedral of Our Lady of the Assumption, is an example of this hybridity. It was first a church, and the mosque came in and then divided the space, and they kind of accommodated itself inside that. You see again this kind of double vaults that resemble a technique of an aqueduct, and then you see both elements from Muslim world and a church cathedral elements are living together. But what is an ideal form for a utopia, you might ask? What is the ideal geometry? A triangle, a square, or a circle? What is the image of the cosmos? There you have it. There is yet a third condition in what we discussed. Not something purely organic in terms of function of cities. Organic like this one, like the image on the left, the organic city. Nor the ideal city as this one. The third condition, something not organic nor from scratch. What if Muslims take over an existing urban structure previously belonging to Sassanid or Byzantine empires? What if a small Arab ruling class take over a predominantly Christian city? First, the existing churches or Zoroastrian temples have been shared for Muslim prayers without touching them. Later on, Muslims added layers of the existing spaces, asserting their distinct identities. You can see that this is 7 centuries before Islam, before the Common Era, way before Islam. The idea that ideal form is circle and its center and radiation is already there. It's a city in Iran, Persia. Marshall Hudson distinguishes Islamic from Islamicate, where the latter, conjunction with social counterpart or Islamdom, connotes a more comprehensive notion of cultural products in dominantly Muslim countries or lands in Dar al-Islam. He argues essentially that these newly conquered or appropriated lands were not all Muslims. So to call them Islamic is good for only theological concepts. But in terms of art, culture, and sociology, we need different concepts. So he used the term Islamicate to involve this hybridity, this multiplicity of multiple cultures. For Hudson, while Islamic art pertains to more or less religious art, Islamicate is first and foremost a cultural designation. Put differently, Islamicate is not much of a religious term, rather refers to social and cultural complex historically associated with Islam and the Muslims. In this precise sense, Islamic architecture had always already been Islamicate. Okay. I have a page here. Sorry. So we have Greek mythology. And there were these gods that they had different mode of thinking and always fighting with each other. Now, my question is that, do we have some sort of similar gods and principles for Islamic art? The answer is yes. We have two lesser known gods, one Nasronius, the other one Carlius Aristanius, that you might know better. They are radically different. Why is so? Why so? The former argues that, Nasr argues that there is principles. There are immutable principles that are transcendental, that relates to the notion of divine and divine presence, and there cannot be changed. There is a vertical horizon that is ahistorical. We cannot touch that. And there is an essence in divine unity. Everything else in the world is just manifestation of divine beauty and divine presence. In doing so, he refers to inner realities that Quran and different layers of Quran that needs to be brought out to understand this sense of unity. The Quran provides the doctrine of unity, while the Prophet provides its multiplicity. Now, let's see what is the implication of Professor Nasr's idea. You see this ball is a ceramic Islamica from Persia. What is Islamic about it? Do you see any Islamic element? Any ideas? Yes, yes. There's Arabic going around, but there are these figures, right? There's figures inside that they don't look Islamic. At least they don't have any covering of hair or anything like that. Why is it Islamic? Just because of that form circumnavigating the age? Let's look at something else. So Nasr says that there is this truth that world is veiled. There is a representational mask that doesn't allow us to see. And what we need to do is to understand that that absolute truth is multiplicitous into different forms, and we need to understand it. Another form, again, the same configuration, basic configuration. You have, again, this Arabic text and then patterns inside it. When you turn that ball on its head, you will get this, right? The minute that you turn it, think about this. You turn it on its head and have the same configuration of geometry, you get this. This is the dome of Shah Abbas mosque in Isfahan. You see the same principle of center and the center of the beauty that is kind of disseminates outward toward the world. And then the idea of center, again, what is this? Do you remember this image? Kaaba, right? What was Kaaba originally? A shrine for idols, right? What happened? You see that it has a centrality, and every Muslim prays toward that. You see the configuration of this, the turning of this element here. It has turned. Why it has turned? To face this building, right? So any mosque building in the world, according to, if we want to look at the principle, needs to orient itself toward Kaaba. So you see the axis that every design does. Professor Ernst has a rather different view. He says, well, if something has a history, it doesn't have an essence. For instance, if Islamic art emphasizes centrality, what is at the center of this image? Or if Islamic art ideal form is circle and centrality of a geometry, why then we have multiple forms that are not quite exactly correspond to that principle or ordinary system? How many of you have been here? Anybody? Yes, yes. What is the name? Taj Mahal in India is an emblem of the notion of Persian gardens that axis, and also idea of the paradise reflected on earth. Paradise garden, and then you have this symmetrical building. But if those are the familiar elements of Islamic architecture, what this fortification looks like? This is a fortification, and these people, and you see that kind of defensive condition, these people try to break in. Have anybody seen this building? This is actually a mosque. This is a mosque, and interestingly in Africa, and interestingly enough, rain washes it every season. So these people are actually rebuilding this mosque every time. And as you see, the interior is very different, no ornamentation, no decoration of what we expect. Professor Ernst would say there is no essence here. You remember the centrality of Kaaba at an orientation. What are the orientation that people are looking toward? How many orientation you can count in their praying? How many orientation you can count here? Are they all looking at the same direction? No. They are not. So, shall we call this an inauthentic mode of praying? Shall we call these people are just confused? They don't know what is Islam, what is prayer? Should we do that? Are we authorized to say that? You should all look at Qibla. You should all orient it that way. Why not? Why it is still a valid form of prayer? Do you need mic? Everybody can practice their religion in their own way. Okay. What else? Yes.
There's a quote in the Quran that says like, the east and west belongs to God, so any direction you face is the face of God. So hence this follows that as long as you're praying correctly, orientation is nothing but direction.
Okay. Then the question is that can this space then be a mosque?
Wait, say that again?
Can this space be a mosque?
Yeah.
How?
Pray in unity, that's it.
But does the orientation matter?
Oh, yeah.
You just said it doesn't.
It doesn't, yeah, if you can't, you know. But if you can, then you probably should.
Ehsan is talking about this auditorium being a mosque, this room that we're in.
If you're to put the rugs facing the right direction,
But these people are not putting anything in the right direction.
but they're also in the dirt. It doesn't seem like they're in a position to go to any like rug facing the right direction.
But that's what I'm precisely asking. Is their prayer still authentic? Yes, please.
It all depends on function, right? Like the name that you give a building depends on what they're using that building for. So just yell that again. Okay. I think it's all about function. The actions that you're doing in a building really define what you're naming it and what you're calling it. So even though it may not look like a traditional mosque, I think if that's the function that it serves and that's what people are doing within that building, then you could argue that you could call it that.
Okay, yes. They weren't nice buildings.
Always nice. No, like I'm pretty sure in the reading it said that there was demarcations by like ashes. So who's to say that that's not their mosque?
So this original, actually, the house of the prophet, right?
Yeah.
But still, it had some degree of sense of orientation, right? The centrality of looking at something, or certain rituals and formalities involved in that. In other words, they had the suit,
Yeah.
right? Is it possible that we say there is no essence? We can do it as far as our intentions are right. Any thoughts?
Well, I think it comes back to what Professor Ernst was talking about like what defines religion. Because if you define religion as a set of rules and traditions, having to do with a belief system, then you need to adhere to those rules and traditions to be part of that religion. But if it's just believing in something, then really the tradition shouldn't matter, and you should be able to believe in whatever way you want to. I mean, there are a lot of Christians in the world who say they're Christian and don't go to church, and there's a lot of people who say they're Jewish and don't go to a temple or synagogue. So like people in reality and in practice treat religion as like an individual kind of thing where they have their own individual interpretations of it, but we still recognize them as having religion.
Okay. What else? Is it possible that we say no, that we can just believe that we have certain religions and it's on my own to decide what part of it is right and what part of I shouldn't be adhering to anything?
I think as long as we're extending the metaphor of
your student today, like the content and essence of your lecture wouldn't have changed if you didn't use the t-shirt.
like
Would have or not?
Would not have.
Would not
If you
have.
had the same lecture, regardless of what you were wearing, maybe our reaction to your lecture might have changed slightly, but that doesn't change the lecture that you're giving. So along traditions, it's how we perceive it as religion could change, but
Okay.
It's like, I mean, like, a lot of faiths, practice, or like, have people practice in those regions or maybe somewhere. That doesn't necessarily change it, but sometimes the environment influences it. Like, remain the mosque remain old, definitely could aid in prayer and meditation, but doesn't necessarily make it a burden.
Interesting. Let me get to something very quickly, to notion of Orientalism, representation of East, and we'll come back to this discussion. This might help us a little bit. When European developed Orientalism, it was a project integral to the rise of a new economic and forms of politics directed and commanded by European nation states. As Professor Wael Halak argues, it was a subset of larger European experiment that created modernity and was profoundly anchored in the paradigmatic concepts of enlightenment. He continues, Orientalism was a project of culture, a project that served as the epistemic substance for colonialism. It has been argued that people of the East, say Indians, are incapable of self-rule. And it is the West white man burden and their civilizing mission to help them out from their primitive, irrational, and merely sensual cultural confines. But Said presupposes that there is no such a thing as representation of cultures. Representations are nothing but exercise of power and instrumental knowledge at the service of imperialism and colonialism. Said, in other words, has foreclosed any other interpretive possibility of one tradition representing the other. Or so Professor Halla argues. This is not a problem of Orientalism alone. Sociology and cultural studies, let alone religious studies, need to talk about the universals, a society, a culture, a religion. One familiar example for us, being in North Carolina, is the notion of the South. Is it its religion, culture, food, traditions, good and bad, or something else altogether? What defines Southern? You can argue that it is no such a thing as a Southern culture. There are only individuals and their histories. But with this fear of generalization and essentialization of some dimension of a culture, we are close to Margaret Thatcher. When faced a critique that British society is against some of the politics pressed by her administration, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom said, quote, and so they are casting their problems on society. And who is society? There is no such thing as society. There are only individual men and women and their families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people look to themselves first. So the question is that when we say culture, say Southern culture, we are facing a problem. We are generalizing something beyond that culture, right? The thing that we want to define. But if we say we can't define it because we are generalizing it, we can't get rid of that term altogether. So say you go to a doctor and the doctor says, well, I don't like categories, I don't like names. You have some sort of problem, but I can't tell you because these names are products of culture and it's generalization. I can't talk about you. It's a product of the institutional medical institution. I wouldn't say what you have precisely, right? There are uses to this generalization. There are useful for certain concepts. So the problem that exists here is that, for instance, the term Islamic architecture didn't exist at all. This is a chart that actually, interestingly enough, Google creates, Ngram. You can Google the history of any term in different languages that appeared in a scholarship. It's rough, but it's still very useful. If you see, in the wake of colonial interventions and inspired by a thrill of fantasy for the Orient, European architects were in search for a universalizing frame that could encapsulate the architecture of the Islamic world. Since there were no ready-made terms available for them, they borrowed from those terminology developed for religious affiliations, namely Saracenic and Mohammedan. It was only by the end of the 19th century that ethical, national, and religious categories were supplanted by a new one, Islamic architecture. It was no longer a question of Spain and Moorish architecture, Persia and Persian architecture, or Egypt and Mamluk architecture, but Islam and Islamic architecture. These newly introduced universals, Islam and Islamics, were byproduct colonial interventions, Orientalist fantasies, and imperial ambitions. Not the entire story. It is only that Islamic architecture becomes self-conscious through Europeans' gaze, or that a retroactive imposition unified heterogeneous entities into an intelligible whole. So, representation of cultures. Can we talk about a different culture and be faithful to them? Or anything? Say, can we talk about Southern culture? Yes or not? Yes.
I think that labels are useful in that you can talk about how the majority of people in a certain group, their commonalities, but when you use terms and labels and generalizations, I think there's no way to avoid that, because then otherwise you take a million years to talk about every individual person in the South instead of just saying Southern culture. But I think going into that, we as a culture need to be more aware of the fact that it's not an all or nothing situation. It's a situation where this is what the majority of people share, but not everyone shares, and some people don't at all. And so you have to be aware of that when you're using these terms.
So this is an excellent point. So think about this. The point is that the problem is that who gets to define a culture? If I define my culture, say a Southern culture, and say certain things about it, or somebody else defines it and use that definition for a mode of condescending toward that culture, for a mode of essentializing it, to use it for certain purposes, then the problem emerges perhaps. And there is an inevitable kind of melting of these two together. Because we, say, agree on certain principles about a culture, others can talk about that culture using those, and at points instrumentalize use of those. Think about this. This is actually a background of many Hollywood films that they talk about Orient, India. And the elements, you see that this beautiful, fascinating architecture, that blue color of the city, that fort up there, and this kind of imperial palace there, all of that actually provides and feeds this Orientalist fantasy. And there is nothing wrong with that, of representation of that culture. It is only becomes problematic when some have argued, for instance, that this building is a vulgar architecture because it combines so many elements. But that reading of that plurality and eclectic architecture as a negative thing is a misunderstanding of that. Think about that in one building, you have, in one of those columns, you have an architecture of a mosque, an architecture of a church, a temple, and a Hindu place of worship. How all of these things have come together. You can't say this is just vulgarities of art. These people couldn't create a homogeneous architecture. But that's actually very reductive. They could have copied, for example, the architecture of the first part to the entire thing to create a homogeneous thing. But this was the moment in history in India that they wanted to have this kind of cultural tolerance and coexistence of multiple forms altogether. So the point of Orientalism, the problem with Orientalism and cultural representation of the East is who gets to define these things. But my question is that whether between those two figures, Professor Ernst and Professor Nasr, one says one thing that has history doesn't have any essence. The other one says there are essences and they find different manifestations. Two arguments are very different and they serve different purposes. Which one do you want to lean toward? Should we abandon the idea of, for instance, an essence in design of a church? Should we say a church doesn't have an essence? That cross that kind of symbolizes the churches is not essential to it at all? This place, for instance, can be a church? Or shall we say, well, you need, if you want to kind of create a kind of intelligibility, if anybody wants to read this as an expression of formality, then we need to adhere to certain traditions. Our traditions are bad altogether. That's my question for you. The problem that we are dealing is that if you go along the lines of essences and absolutism, to say that there are essences and there are immutable, they are perfect, we cannot touch them, we might go close to fundamentalism. If we go to the other side and say, no, everything goes, there is history, and across history things has changed, we are facing the danger of dissolution of any cultural centrality, that if somebody says, is it Islam? We can say, well, anything can be called Islam. Then the position is that how do we want to kind of find a kind of in-between space between the two approaches, or any better way of thinking about them? Any thoughts, final thoughts from you? Do we have, for instance, the principle of design of a church? If you enter a space and you can't distinguish it as a church, is it still acceptable for you? Or you need to see and read and understand certain elements, certain signs? Any thoughts? Okay, yes, there is one here.
Hello. Okay. I really do think it's about like functionality. I think for certain people, having those religious symbols is important, but I also think that the way that we perceive your clothing can change as decades pass and trends change. I think the same thing can be said for certain religious buildings. Like certain symbols may fall in and out of style depending on how you choose to interpret religious texts or like religious meaning. But ultimately, I think if the function is there, then that can be called that building or that place. Yeah.
Okay, very good. All right, thank you very much. We are at the end of the time. Thank you. Thank you.